All right, morning. Let us begin. Let's begin by thanking our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors, Avraham Shaindy Kelman, for dedicating all the shurim and drashos this month of Chodesh Elul in memory of their parents. We hope in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, and the family a Nechama. We thank our week of learning, Jesse and Rivka Meirovitz, in honor of the birth of a baby boy, to Shmuel and Shira Artman. Mazel tov to the Artmans. Our day of learning, Yehuda Buchwalter. First of all, a Baruch Haba from Eretz Yisrael, and thankful to be in the Shir. If he can't be in Eretz Yisrael, beautiful. Although not a Mamala Makom for Eretz Yisrael, but Baruch Hashem, we're very happy to have you back. The Daf Yomi sponsors for today, the Plunka family, in commemoration of the yard site of Rabbi Yehuda Lo ben Betzalel Maharal of Prague, today on the 18th of Elul. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Maharal's Neshama will have an Aliyah. All right, so with that, let us begin. A lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, beautiful, beautiful Gemara. And Emirat Hashem Mishal Tov Mitzlachos, a brand new parak. Today's daf is daf Nun 50. We are picking up Emirat Hashem. I believe we left off. Amar Rabbi Lazar, Gedola Gemilas Chasadim Yosem Minat Tzedakah. Is that about right? A little bit lower. Amar Rabbi Lazar, Gadla Oset Tzedakah. Beautiful. That's where it's really. I'm sorry. Ein Tzedakah. Beautiful. Perfect. So that is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 lines up from the bottom. The Amar Rabbi Lazar. Ein Tzedakah mishtalemes el lefi chesed sheba. This is actually very beautiful. So Rabbi Lazar says that tzedakah is only mishtalemes. Now mishtalemes literally means completed in accordance with the chesed that is inside of it. Now we'll see what that means in just a moment. Actually, let's see what it means now. Take a look at Rashi. It's the end of the first wide line of Rashi onto the second wide line. Rashi says, El lefi gemilos chasadim sheba, hanesina hiyatzedakah. So here's what's interesting. We began to speak about this yesterday a little bit. Remember, we're focusing on two different ideas. And gemilos chasadim. We're going to further differentiate between those concepts right now. But the what the Gemara says is as follows: that the power of tzedakah, the impact of tzedakah, is directly measured in accordance with the amount of chesed that is in the tzedakah. Now, what does that mean? So now look at Rashi again, and this is really very beautiful. Rashi says, "Hanesina hiya tzedakah." So the giving of the money, that's tzedakah, right? The mitzvah of tzedakah is a very straightforward mitzvah. You give money to someone in need. V'hatorech hu chesed. So what's the chesed in tzedakah? Tzedakah is the act of giving. The chesed could be in how you give or in what you give. For example, he says, Kigon, molicha lebeisa. This is incredible. So for example, if I give money to an ani, and I leave an envelope, outside my door, and I call up, I call up ani, money's outside, come and get it. So that's tzedakah. If I take the money to the ani, right, and make it easier for him, that's chesed in the tzedakah. That's chesed in the tzedakah. O torech shetalalo harbe kagon nosin lo pas afuya o beged lilbosh o maos beishat v'or mitzuya shelo yotzi maos of liibot shenosin libo v'dait lo tavaso shel ani. Or for example, he says, I give the ani, instead of just giving him, $1 to go get food, I give him a baked loaf of bread. Or instead of giving him money to go get clothing, I give him the clothing. Or I dafka give him the money at a time where the prices of wheat are cheap, so he's able to go ahead and buy more for that dollar, get more for that dollar. So this is incredible. So what Rashi is explaining over here is tzedakah is the act of giving the money. The chesed is how you give it and when you give it. But the truth is, Rashi explains the chesed in one word. It's the Torah. You see, if a person just gives money, that's tzedakah. That's tzedakah. But if you exert yourself for the benefit of the person in need, that's chesed. Chesed is the tircha. Chesed is when I push myself to do something for someone else in order to make their life a little bit easier. Such a profound idea. It's the same amount of money. It's the same amount of money. It's the same $100 I'm giving the ani. But the chesed is how much I put myself out there, how much I push myself, how much I inconvenience myself in order to go to make someone else's life just a little bit easier. So therefore, Rabbi Lazar says, Ein tzedakah mishtalemes. The true power of tzedakah is only completed when? El lefi chesed sheba. Only in accordance with the amount of chesed that is part of that act of tzedakah. Shnei emar, zir lachem tzedakah, l'tzedakah, v'katzru lefi chesed. Because the pasuk says literally, like we quoted this pasuk yesterday, literally sow for yourselves chesed, v'katzru, but harvest in accordance, for tzedakah, but harvest in accordance with the chesed. So the tzedakah is the act of planting, but how much you actually harvest is dependent on the chesed, which is embedded in your act of tzedakah. Absolutely beautiful. See, also we often bifurcate these two things. There's tzedakah and there's chesed. And here the Gemara is saying, no, the shaila is, how much chesed is there in your tzedakah? And the impact and the profundity of your ma'aseh tzedakah is directly related to the amount of chesed in your tzedakah. It's incredible. In three ways, gemilas chasadim chesed is greater than tzedakah. How so? Number one, tzedakah b'mamono, gemilas chasadim bein begufo bein b'mamono. So tzedakah you do with your money, right? Tzedakah is giving of money. Chesed can be done with your money or with your guf, right? Because remember again, but said is the interesting part. Tzedakah itself is under the umbrella of gemilos chasadim, of course. So lemaisa again, but chesed is greater than tzedakah in that again, if I do something physical for someone, that's not a ma'aseh tzedakah, but it's a ma'aseh of gemilos chasadim. So tzedakah only with money, gemilos chasadim whether with money or ultimately again with your body. Now Rashi points out over here, what are examples of gemilas chasadim with your body? Rashi says, gemilas chasadim begufo, kigo maspid lameis, no so v'kovro, misameach chasan, mal v'chavero baderech. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. So he gives examples over here. You give a hesped, you give a eulogy. That's chesed, right? You go ahead and you bury the dead. That's chesed. Your labor dig, misameach chasan v'kala. That's chesed. This last one, mal v'chavero baderech, Rabbi says, an interesting. What's mal v'chavero baderech? You lend your friend money when you and your friend are traveling. So I'm with my chaber. He forgot his wallet. It's not tzedakah. In other words, he has money. He just doesn't have money. He just doesn't have money on him. That notion of just going ahead and helping him out in that moment, that's chesed. That's chesed. So chesed you could do whether it's with your body, maspid meis misameach chasam v'kalo, or with your money. Next, the Gemara says, tzedakah laniyim, gemilas chasad mein laniyim ben ashirim. Tzedakah is done for the poor. Tzedakah is done for the poor. Chesed can be done for people whether they're poor or whether they're wealthy. As I will say, at some point in time, everyone needs chesed. Right? Everyone needs to do chesed, but at some point in time, everyone needs to be the recipient of chesed as well. Tzedakah l'chaim, but say this is beautiful. Tzedakah can only be given ultimately again for the living. Gemilas chasadim bein l'chaim bein l'mesim. But chesed you could do both for the living as well as the dead. Pretty incredible Gemara. I'll say again, that's the example for the dead. Rashi pointed out, maspid, giving a eulogy, burying, those are all acts of chesed. V'amar Belazar, kala oset tzedakah u'mishpat, when a person performs acts of tzedakah, which is charity, mishpat, justice. So the Gemara says, kilu, milei kala olam kulo. See, I will say, it's interesting, by the way, what does that mean, a person performs tzedakah u'mishpat? So I saw it brought down, bring down, because you see this in a couple of different places, that tzedakah u'mishpat is one thing. See, I will say, Rabbi Tursky, Dr. Avraham Tursky, actually has a very beautiful piece on this, where he explains that people define tzedakah as charity. So what does charity sound like? What is charity? Charity is something very nice, right? It's something very nice, right? You're charitable. So usually that word means, you have a midah of charitability. I don't know if that's a word, but it's a nice thing. He says if you look at the word tzedakah, it's also tzedek, right? Tzedek means justice. So Rabbi Tursky explains very beautifully that the act of giving tzedakah is not some magnanimous act of charity that shows that one is just such an incredible individual. Tzedakah is tzedek, it's justice. Meaning, the Ribono Shel Olam gave some people money and he didn't give other people money. And the way the world works is, if you have, your obligation is to give. It's not some type of act of charity that's some magnanimous act. It's tzedek. It's the way the world is structured. There are those who have and there are those who don't have. And those who have an obligation as the custodians of the Ribono Shel Olam's wealth, because that's what we are, is to provide to those who don't. So it's not some over-the-top, incredible, magnanimous gesture that someone is doing. It's tzedek. It's the way the world works. It's the way the world is supposed to happen. So some bring down that tzedek mishpat is not two different things. It's tzedakah mishpat. I'm sorry. It's one thing. It's one thing. Tzedakah and mishpat are the same thing, because the act of giving tzedakah, by definition, is mishpat. Now, of course, where I come in sometimes is, in other words, we're as an individuals, maybe how much I give, how I give, to whom I give. Those are all choices that I make. But the notion of giving, if you have, that's mishpat. That's mishpat. That's tzedek. That's the way the world is structured and the way the world has to run. It's an incredible yisod. So kilu malei kol ha'olam chesed shneimar oiv tzedakah mishpat chesed Hashem mala haaretz. Good. One who goes ahead and loves tzedakah mishpat, and that's why, again, that's how tzedakah and mishpat kind of go together. They're actually synonyms. They actually really work together. So one who loves tzedakah mishpat, chesed Hashem ala haaretz, will fill the entire world with chesed. So if you become a baal tzedakah and you go ahead and ultimately, again, you give tzedakah, you fill the world ultimately again with chesed. Rabbi said, and this is incredible. Shema tomar kol haba likvotz kopetz. But say maybe you'll say, you know what? Does anyone who wants to do tzedakah and chesed has the opportunity to do so? But say this is incredible. So maybe you'll think again, tzedakah and chesed, those opportunities are open to anyone and everyone. Talmud lomar mayakar chastecha elokim. How precious are the chasadim of Hashem? Which sounds about say like what? The opportunities for chesed are not open to everyone. They're not open to everyone. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Shema kol haba likvotz v'lasos tzedakah v'chesed kopetz umaspikin umamtziin lo anoshim mehuganim lekach. You might think that whoever wants the opportunity to give tzedakah, the Ribono Shel Olam makes those opportunities available to him without reservation. Talmud lomar ma yakar tzarich lo seis leiv v'litrach v'lirdof achareha lefi she'ena mitzuya tamid lezakos bala mehuganim. See, I was saying, the challenge with tzedakah is knowing that you're giving to a legitimate source, right? Knowing that you're giving to a person who's truly in need. So you might have thought that opportunities for genuine tzedakah abound anywhere and everywhere. Pasuk says, "Ma'yakar chastecha," real chesed, real tzedakah, sometimes it's hard to come by. So the Gemara says, "Yachol af yarei shamayim kein." You might have thought even someone who has yirah shamayim might have difficulty finding tzedakah opportunities. Talmud lomar, v'chesed Hashem me'olam va'ad olam al yireav. The pasuk says the chesed of Hashem is for all eternity is upon those who fear Him. Which Rabbi means if a person possesses yiras Hashem, a person has a yirei shamayim, the Ribono Shel Olam presents him with opportunities for chesed. If I'm not a yirei shamayim, the opportunities for tzedakah and for chesed are a little bit harder to come by. So we'll say, what an incredible Gemara. Because what the Gemara is teaching us is something so beautiful. The opportunity to give tzedakah and the opportunity to do chesed is a schos. It's a privilege. On one hand, it's a mandate, like we just said before, tzedakah or mishpat. It's the way the world works. If you have, it's your obligation and mandate to give. But it's a privilege to give. It's a privilege to give. And how do you know it's a privilege to give? Because the Ribono Shel Olam does not present everyone with opportunities for genuine tzedakah and with opportunities for genuine chesed. So if the Ribono Shel Olam presents you with those opportunities, I should say differently, who does He present those opportunities to? To the Yirei Shamayim. To the person who truly reveres and loves the Ribono Shel Olam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu rewards him ultimately with the opportunities to give and the opportunities to do. See, I will say, sometimes we feel like a little bit overwhelmed by all the things we're asked for. What a paradigm shift. Don't be overwhelmed. Say, wow, what a schus. Because if there are so many opportunities, if I'm being asked for so many different things, that must mean that the Ribono Shel Olam, He's presenting me with all of these incredible opportunities, that must be Kadosh Baruch who's placing these opportunities right in front of me. The Gemara says that's indicative of the fact that a person is a true Yirei Shamayim, because only Yirei Shamayim gets presented with opportunities. The rest of the people ultimately sometimes have difficulty finding genuine giving tzedakah or chesed opportunities. It's such a different way to look at when we're asked for something, not as something being put upon us, but an incredible schus that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is placing in front of us. It's so beautiful. The Gemara goes weiter. Any person who has chen. We'll say chen is one of those good words that does not really have a good English translation, right? How would you translate it? Favor, right? I'm sorry? Charm, grace, right? Which doesn't really help all that much, right? It works better when you say that person has chen. Kind of everyone knows what it means, even though it's a bit difficult to articulate. But chen means all of these things. Chen, it's almost like that person is genuine. Genuinity. It's another one for today. You can write that down. That's a new one, right? Right. So a person possesses that it's just a genuine person. Person who has chen, bi'adua shehu yarei shamayim. But say chen is a reflection ultimately again of being a yarei shamayim, which I will say also often tells you for us also, because sometimes we don't care about what other people think about us. But it's important to care about what other people think about you, because the Maisa, sometimes the way the world perceives you is a good mirror to where you're holding in life. And if you don't have chen, the Gemara says maybe a person has to check the Yirah Shamayim. So if a person has chen, I know that I'm a Yirah Shamayim. Shneimar Chas Hashem Olam Ba'ad Olam Al Yirev. Pia Pascha B'Chachma V'Soras Chesed Al. Beautiful. Well, so you can use this one Shabbos night, right? What does it mean when it says her mouth is open with wisdom? The Torah is chesed al lishona, and the Torah of chesed is on her tongue. What does that mean? What does it mean, Torah is chesed? Is there a Torah of chesed, a Torah not of chesed? There are two different Torahs. We'll say, isn't that beautiful? This is Ella Torah lishma zohi Torah shel chesed. When you learn Torah lishma, I will say the topic of Torah lishma is a big discussion in general, what exactly that means. But let's assume for a moment right now on the most basic level that Torah lishma means I'm learning Torah for the sake of learning Torah, not for my own kavod, not so I could know more than anyone else, not so I could show anyone else up. Torah lishma. I'm learning Torah because the Ribono Shel Olam commanded me to learn his Torah. That's Torah shel chesed. Shelo lishma. Person learns Torah for other ulterior motives. Zohi Torah she'ena shel chesed. That's a Torah, ultimately, again, that's not of chesed. Ika da'amri, an alternate version, this is so beautiful. Torah lelamda, Zohi Torah shel chesed. We'll say, when you learn Torah with the intention to what? To teach it to others. And we'll say, that's Torah shel chesed. Now, what does it mean to teach it to others? Teach it to others doesn't mean that you learn Succah, Daf Nun, and you go home to your family. Okay, everybody sit down. Come on, we're doing the Daf today together. Yeah, no, you can't play outside. You can't do this. We're learning Torah. That's not what it means. Lelamda means you take what you learn and you model it. You take what you learn and you instill those values in others. That, in other words, we'll say there are two ways a person can learn Torah. A person can learn the Gemara, and as soon as the Gemara closes, the lessons and the impact is done. It's done. It's an intellectual pursuit that I do for whatever amount of time during the day, but it does not inform anything else in my life. But when I'm lilamda, when I take my Torah and I use it to shape everything else in my life, I use it to shape my relationships, I use it to shape my chinuch, I use it to shape how I act as an individual. By definition, I'm teaching that Torah to others by going ahead and modeling those lessons that I've inculcated within myself. The Gemara says, that's a Torah shel chesed. Shelo lelamda. But if I just learn Torah and it's very nice, I find it interesting, but it doesn't really, either I don't teach it to others, I don't model it for others, it doesn't inform the rest of the way that I live. Zo ti Torah she'eno shel chesed. That's a Torah that's not of chesed. Now both say, again, it's still Torah. Torah is Torah, and there's ultimately, again, reward and benefit for everything we do. But Lamaisa, what we strive for is that Torah shel chesed. Torah shel chesed being a Torah lishma, and a Torah that I don't just learn and close the book on, but a Torah that I learn and that in many ways I teach to others, by modeling those lessons that I've learned, ultimately again in the way that I live. Incredible. Incredible. We'll say back to Sukkah. Back to Sukkah. Remember again, Nisach HaMayim. So the Mishnah said, the same way we do Nisach HaMayim during the week, we do Nisach HaMayim on Shabbos, with one notable exception, which was they would fill up the water before Shabbos. Right? They would fill up the water before Shabbos. So the Gemara says, now remember, the Mishnah went out of its way to explain that halacha lemaisa, they would fill up the water in a barrel, in a gold barrel, she'ena mikudeshes, that was not consecrated, meaning a non-kli shares barrel. So the Gemara says, why? What's the problem? V'amai ne'esvi mikudeshes. Now the assumption, remember, why don't they fill it up in a consecrated barrel on Erev Shabbos? Because remember again, if they fill it up in a consecrated barrel, it becomes consecrated. If it becomes consecrated, then bipashtos, it is subject to the issue of lina. Remember again, any consecrated item which sits overnight in the Beis HaMikdash becomes disqualified. So essentially what they did is they drew the water, put it in a non-consecrated kli, therefore the water doesn't become consecrated. If it doesn't become consecrated, then halacha l'maisa, it's not subject to the prohibition of lina, to which the Gemara says, va'amai, ne'si b'mikudeshes. So the Gemara says, why don't you just go ahead and bring it in a consecrated utensil? So the Gemara says, amr zi'iri kasavar, ein shir l'mayim. So I just want to point out, Rashi points this out, because there's another way also that you could have also avoid this, is go ahead and just fill up much more water than you need. If you fill up much more water than you need, then it's also clear that you're not actively designating it right now for consecrated purposes. And that could also avoid the lina. Amr Ziri says, Kasavar, ein shir l'mayim. First of all, Ziri says, there's no particular shear for water for Nisach HaMayim. I mean, there's a floor, but there's no ceiling. The klisharis mekachin shalomidas. Furthermore, a klishares is mekadesh shalomidas. Rabbi said, this is fascinating. So a klishares, which is a service utensil, will consecrate its contents even if you don't have specific intent. So therefore, again, the props, if you were to put that water into a klishares, even if you did not have intent to consecrate that water, if you put it there on Friday, what happens? It becomes consecrated. And again, there's no shear for the water, see? So therefore, again, however much water you put in there, ultimately it becomes consecrated even without specific intent, which then means it becomes subject to lina, which then means that by Shabbos morning it would be unfit for use. Top of nun, today's daf, top of nun, v'maisi b'mekudeshes, if sulu. And therefore, again, Zeiri says, because there's no shear for the water, and because number two, a klisharis is mekadesh shalomidas, right? It sanctifies, it consecrates even without specific intent. If you were to put it in a klisharis on Friday, the water would become disqualified. That's Zeiri. Chizkiah Amar, klisharis and mekachin elamidas. Chizkiah says, not true. Actually, a klisharis is only mekadesh midas. In other words, klisharis only consecrates when you have specific intent for it to consecrate. So what's the problem? So we'll say, if that's the case, then what should I be able to do? Put the water on Friday where? Into a klisharis. Just don't have in mind that the klisharis should consecrate it. Let the water sit in that, and then Shabbos morning, have in mind that the klisharis should be mekadesh water. You're good to go. So why do I have to draw it in an unconsecrated utensil? Ugzeira shemayomru ladas niskadshu. We'll say the concern is that halacha l'maisa, people won't know. In other words, if that water was drawn in a klisharis, people don't know whether or not you had in mind for the klisharis to be mekadesh, didn't have in mind for the klisharis to be mekadesh. So people will just as easily assume that when you drew that water on Friday, you had in mind for the klisharis to be mekadesh. And if that's the case, people will reach the logical conclusion that what? That the water for Nisach HaMayim is not subject to the prohibition of lina. Therefore, in order to avoid that, we draw it in an unconsecrated utensil. Also, I just want to point out, no one's arguing on the statement of the Mishnah, which is the statement of the Mishnah is when they had to do Nisach HaMayim on Shabbos, they would draw the water on Friday in a gold unconsecrated utensil. Everyone agrees with that. We're just trying to figure out the why. So remember again, so Zeiri says the problem is klisharis is mekadesh shalomidas. So therefore, again, if you draw that water on Friday in a klisharis, that klisharis automatically sanctifies it, whether you want it to or not. And therefore, by the time you get to Shabbos morning, you have a problem of lina, of the water having sat in the klisharis overnight. So therefore, you have to draw it in a non-klisharis. Chizkiah says, not true. Klisharis is only mekadesh lidas, which means technically you should be able to go ahead and draw the water on Friday. In a concern, people don't know if you did have das or you didn't have das on Friday when you drew the water. So if you draw the water in a kli shares, they'll just as easily assume you did have das for the kli shares to mekadesh the water even on Friday. And the only reason the water is usable on Shabbos is why? Because the water is not nifsal balina. The prohibition or the issue of lina, of staying overnight, doesn't apply to the water of the Succah, which of course is an erroneous conclusion. Therefore, in order to avoid that erroneous conclusion, halacha l'maisa, we just use an unconsecrated utensil. Amar Rabbi Zera, afilu tema yesh shir l'mayim ukli sharis in mekachin elamidas. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Zera says, even if you say that there is a shear for the water, and ultimately again, and kli sharis is not mekadesh in mekachin elamidas, kli sharis only sanctifies with specific intent. The issue over here is Gzera Sheme Yomru Lekidush Yadayim Vraglayim Milan. People will think something very interesting, which is that halacha l'maisa, maybe they'll think that the water that you're using was actually the surplus water that was drawn for the Kiddush Yadayim Vraglayim of the Kohen Gadol for Yom Kippur. Right? Remember again, Yom Kippur was only a couple of days beforehand. Maybe that would, if you take a quick look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, Gzera Shem Yomru Kiddush Yadayim Vraglayim. Rashi says the Kohen Gadol Malom, the Kitshim Bekli, Shemikhanshim Yadayim Vraglayim Ela B'mayim Mekudashim Dumya Dekir, Shenimshach B'Shemen HaMishcha, or Mekadesh Es Meima Vehim Lekiddush Yadayim Vraglayim, Baf Kiton Shalzav Shayu Osa Lefal. I'm just going to read Kohen Kachem and Yadav Vraglov. If you skip a little bit, the less lay shiura shafilava kuflugin ruuyin heim likli finis kachifichi chazdim amar ein linama alas benasachim. So I will say they might think that this water was left over, was originally drawn for the kiddush adayim vraglayim of the Kohen Gadol Yom Kippur, and once again it's been left over for a while. So you see from here that water used for nisa chamayim is not subject to lina. Okay, it's the same idea. Rabbi Zera is just saying people will come to the erroneous conclusion that the water used for nisa chamayim is not subject to lina. So I will say, so bottom line, everyone is agreeing with the conclusion, which is that halacha l'maisa, when they did nisa chamayim on Shabbos, how would you do that? What would you do? Fill up the water in what? In a golden non-clay sharis. Why? Either because, according to some, that kli sharis will be mekadesh the water on Friday, and therefore again will invalidate the water by Shabbos morning because of lina. That some hold is an actual issue, and some hold no. The kli sharis, even if you were to burn kli sharis only consecrates midas with specific intent, which means that you could fill it up with a kli sharis on Friday and let it sit overnight because it's not mekudash yet. But there's a problem of perception. People don't know that and may draw the erroneous conclusion that the water sat overnight yet is still usable because it's not subject to lina. So again, the only machlokis, I will say here, there's two machlokim that exist. Machlokis number one is yesh lamayim shir, ein lamayim shir. Is there a ceiling amount for nisa chamayim? And machlokis number two is kli sharis mekadesh shalom midas or only midas. Is a kli sharis sanctify something again only with specific intent or without specific intent? I will tell you that on that piece, the Rambam paskins that kli sharis is only mekadesh midas. That ultimately a service utensil only sanctifies or consecrates the contents if there is a specific intent. Good. So the Gemara goes weiter. Nishpacha onis gala. So remember again, the Mishnah said that if the water spilled or the water becomes uncovered, right? Ultimately, again, they would replace the water with water from the kiyur, right? So remember again, this gets into a general issue of mayin megulin, right? That ultimately, again, water that was left exposed, that was left open overnight, one is not supposed to drink mayin megulin. We saw this in brachas. Right, so you leave a cup of water out overnight, you should not drink it the next morning. Why not? Chazal were concerned for what? For snake venom, right? That a snake may come, go ahead and inject its venom into the water, and it's problematic. I'll just point out the issue of mashkin megulin, which is a halacha in Shulchan Aruch. The issue of mashkin megulin, why aren't we careful? Well, some people are careful with this today. Why aren't we as careful with this today? So the Aruch HaShulchan has a piece where he explains on a very simple level Because you live really in places with poisonous snakes running around, Baruch Hashem. So therefore, again, the issue just has kind of been obviated. So because it was a responsive halacha to an actual situation, people have generally become, but there are people who are definitely still machmir on this even to today. In any event, the Gemara says, Va'amai, le'avim misnenes, why can't I use the water? Supposed to say, here's the situation. I brought in water for Nisach HaMayim. I was left open overnight. Mishnah says I can't use it. Why can't I use it? Let me just run it through a strainer. And it'll be usable. Why? The Gemara says, our Mishnah must not reflect the view of Rabbi Nechemia, because what does Rabbi Nechemia say? Disanya, misanenes yesh ba mishum gilui. Even if you go ahead and you run the liquid through a strainer, ultimately, again, it's still going to be prohibited because of mashkin magulin. Ultimately, liquids left uncovered. Rabbi Nechemia, no. Imasai, when is it problematic? Only bisman shatachtona magula. We'll say now the strainer that they're actually referring to over here is for making spiced wine. Rasha's konditon. So again, just so you understand, there were like two receptacles. There was an upper strainer and then a bottom receptacle. Ultimately, again, that caught the strained liquid. That caught the strained liquid. So Nehemiah says, when do we say that even if you strained the liquid? Now, what's the point of straining the liquid? Why are you straining it? In order to go ahead and get out the snake venom, as we'll see in just a moment. So, when you're making spiced wine, that's not the reason you were straining it. The way you made spiced wine is you would take like a packet of spices and you would pour the wine or the weak wine or water mixture over that, and that would make the wine. Rabbi Nechemia says over here, ultimately, again, if you're trying to strain a liquid that was left open, the only time the strainer doesn't work is if the bottom receptacle is open. Because if the bottom receptacle was left open, then what? Then the snake could have come to that and injected its venom in the bottom receptacle. However, but if the bottom receptacle was covered, even though the upper one was left uncovered, ein ba mishum gilui. There's no issue of uncovered liquids. Why? Because snake venom is like a sponge. It floats in place. So we'll say, so the point the Gemara is making over here, let's get back to the base mikdash. The water for the Nisach HaMayim uncovered overnight. What's the big deal? Just run it through a strainer. Because one thing that everybody agrees with is that what? If there is venom, you will get that out. You will get that out through the strainer. So why not just run it through the strainer and use the water? To which the Gemara says, Afilu tim Rabbi Nechemia. No. Even Rabbi Nechemia would agree that over here by Nisach HaMayim, you can't employ that process. Why? The Gemara says, when did Rabbi Nechemia say that you could run the water through a strainer and therefore use it? That's for common mundane use. You want to drink your water, you want it out at night, but you're concerned about Chazal's and Ekton the Mashma Gula, no problem. Run a strainer and you're good to go. However, the Gemara says, but for the Beis HaMikdash, mi amar, ultimately again Rabbi Nechemia say that. After all, Velesei Rabbi Nechemia, hakriveu na lepchasecha, hayitzircha ayisa panecha amar Hashem tzivako. So also the Gemara over here quotes the pasuk from Malachi. So Malachi says, the first part of the pasuk is v'chi sagishun iver lizboach. Ein vara v'chi sagishu piseach v'chola. So Rabbi Malachi said, would you bring a blind animal, a sick animal, a crippled animal to offer up before HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So essentially the idea is, when you offer things up before the Ribbon Shalom, you do it b'derech kavod. So to start going ahead and straining water to make sure there's no snake venom for something that's going to be part of the mizbeach, it's not right. It's not appropriate. So again, you have a personal issue of mashkin megulin, and you want to remedy that by running your wine or running your water through a strainer. Absolutely, it works. On a utilitarian level, it works. But for Gavoa, for the Beis HaMikdash, for actually service purposes, no. Well, once there's a chashash, we just don't use that water and we'll replace with new water as befitting the covet of temple service. Beautiful. We'll say Hadrin Aloch, Lulav Vara. We'll say Mazel Tov. Let's say now we are going to get into a parak, which is just, every parak is beautiful. and every parak is special, right? Just like every question is good, except the ones that aren't, right? But Lamaisa, every parak in Shas is fantastic. So we're going to see some beautiful, overwhelming Agadah over here, and what's great about it is Emir Hashem heading right into the Yom Tovim, which is our Sukkis is going to be enhanced. It already has been enhanced by so many of the Gemaras that we've seen. Incredible. Okay, Mishnah. Hachalil, Chamisha v'shisha. The Chalil Basa is a flute. The playing of the flute sometimes was done for 5 days, sometimes was done for 6 days. What flute? Hachalil shel beis hashoeva. And this ultimately again refers to the flute that ultimately again was played in the beis hashoeva. Now we'll discuss what the beis. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here beis hashoeva. Kol simcha zu eina ela b'shul nisach hamayim. So we're going to speak about the simchas beis hashoeva. Now the simchas beis hashoeva was the celebration that took place around the avoda of nisach hamayim. Incredible simcha that took place. Now again, I want to just point out, we've spoken about nisach hamayim. We have not really spoken about the symbolism of Nisach HaMayim. Why exactly? Remember again, Nisach HaMayim is incredibly dramatic and unique because we have plenty of libations, plenty of Nisachim. They're just usually wine, right? Sukkot is the only time we do a libation of water. So we'll discuss the symbolism of that. I mean, it's pretty much is kind of self-evident from the fact that Sukkot itself is really the beginning of the rainy season. And rain, by definition, is the lifeline of Eretz Yisrael. It's the lifeline of everything. But in Eretz Yisrael, it's even more acute. So again, we'll get into this, but the flute was played as part of the celebration of the Beis HaShoeva. Beis HaShoeva, again, we'll see the Nisach HaMayim. Shina docha lo asa Shabbos lo asa Yom Tov. But ultimately, again, this playing of the flute is not docha Shabbos, and it's not docha Yom Tov. Now, I will say, we're going to see over here why that is exactly, that the playing of the flute is not docha Shabbos, not docha Yom Tov. Now we understand, by the way, why sometimes the flute was 5 days, sometimes the flute was 6 days. How so? If halacha l'maisa, the first day of Yom Tov coincided with Shabbos, right, then you would play the flute for 6 days. But if the first day of Yom Tov did not coincide with Shabbos, then you would not play the flute on Yom Tov, and you would not play the flute on Shabbos. You would only go ahead and play the flute for 5 days. I will say, in general, what's the issue with playing instruments on Shabbos? Issue, right, is tikkun mana. Interestingly enough, is fixing. The concern is that the instrument may break and one may come to fix it. And the act of fixing, ultimately, again, tikkun mana, is in and of itself doma l'malacha. Good. So we'll say, we'll analyze that more. Amud Beis. Itmar. Rav Yehuda v'Ravina chad tani shoeva v'chad tani chashuva. It's very interesting. Two different girsaos in the Mishnah. One opinion said they would play the flute by the simchas beis hashoeva, and one said by the simchas beis chashuva. The both says the Gemara. Amar Mar Zutra man de tani shoeva lo mishtabish, man de tani chashuva lo mishtabish. They're both right. No one is mistaken. Man de tani shoeva lo mishtabish. The one who says shoeva, he's not mistaken. Why dichsev ushaftem mayim bisason? Because the pasuk says you will draw water with joy. That, remember, so we've seen this quoted before from the Navi Yeshaya, a remez to Nisach HaMayim. So therefore, again, Nisach HaMayim is called ushaftem. Simchas beis hashoeva, literally again a celebration of the drawing of the water. Ushaftem mayim b'sason, you will draw water with joy. That represents the Nisach HaMayim. Uman de tani chashuva lo mishtabish, and the one who ultimately again says chashuvas, right? Simchas beis chashuva or simchas chashuva is also not mistaken. Rav Nachman mitzvah chashuvahi, that the mitzvah of Nisach HaMayim is a very important mitzvah. Uba misheshes gimei bereishis, and ultimately again it was prepared already from the beginning of creation. So I will say this notion that the mitzvah was prepared from the beginning of creation. Rashi says over here, the Amran Lael shisin nivru misheshes gimei bereishis lekabel hanasach. And I will say this goes back to our Gemara yesterday, that the shisin themselves were created from the beginning of creation. Right? Why? So now the Gemara kind of, interestingly enough, fills in the blank. So the shisin were created for Nisach HaMayim, right? From the beginning, that hollowed out tunnel from earth, from we'll call it the top of the earth, ultimately to the Tahom, which was created during Sheishis and Mebreshis, was created for Nisach HaMayim. So central and so important and so chashuv is the mitzvah of Nisach HaMayim that literally the mechanism for it was actually created during the 6 days of creation. Incredible. Tan Rabbanon. So we'll say, so therefore again, just note to self, when it says Zeu Chalosh Shel Beis HaShoeva, so some have the girsa of Beis HaShoeva, some have the girsa of Beis HaChashuva, and they are both correct, and they're both referring to the same thing, which is the Nisach HaMayim. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. Tan Rabbanon, Hachalil Doches HaShabbos Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. So Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda holds that Allah Lamaisa, ultimately the playing of the flute is Docha Shabbos. Does set aside the halachas of Shabbos. The Chachamim omrim af yamtiv eino docha. The Chachamim say not only is the flute not docha Shabbos, but what? It's not docha yamtiv. As I will say, I forgot to mention the second day. Yesterday, Eli and Judy Benzev dedicated the shir. They stayed with Eli had yahrzeit for his father, Rav Chaim Aryeh ben Reb Zev Dov. And yesterday I forgot to announce it. I'm sorry. And today I have the piece of paper sitting right in front of me. It's an incredible yisod. Something could be sitting right in front of you, but if you don't look in the right direction, you just simply will miss it. It's been sitting literally 3 inches away from me. So Rabbi Eli, I apologize. Your father's neshama should have an aliyah, and the family should have a nechama. So therefore, again, we now have a machlokes. Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says that Allah Lamaisa, the flute is docha Shabbos. It is docha Shabbos. Chachamim say af yamtiv ein docha. Chachamim say no, it's not even docha yamtiv. Forget about Shabbos. It's not docha yamtiv. So the Gemara says, let's analyze. Rabbi Yosef. Here we go. Machlokes b'shir shal karban. We'll say, what's the machlokes about? So this is riveting. So the Gemara says as follows. Rabbi Yosef says the truth is, this is a fundamental machlokes about shir shel karban. Now remember again, karban, any karban, or say karbanos were accompanied, not any karban, karbanos were accompanied by shira, right? Remember they offered up the karban tamid. Every single day the Leviim would sing the shir shel yom, right? A particular kapitel from Tehillim, ultimately again for the reflective of that day's avoda. So listen to this. Rabbi Yossi Savar Ikar Shira Bekli Va'avodahi V'dochas HaShabbos. Rabbi Yossi was like this, Rabbi say, that instruments are the Ikar of Shira, right? There is no Shira without instruments. Ikar Shira Bekli, which means the primary way to perform Shira is with instruments. So Rabbi Yossi, remember again, just follow this train of thought for just a moment. Shira is part of Avoda, right? Rabbi Yossi holds instruments are integral for Shira. So, if instruments are integral for Shira, and Shira is part of Avoda, and Avoda is Docha Shabbos, therefore what? Therefore, the instruments are Docha Shabbos also, right? If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, right? So therefore, again, if Shira is part of Avoda, Avoda is Docha Shabbos, so too the playing of instruments will be Docha Shabbos as well. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Rabbanon Savri, no. Eker Shira Bepeh. No, you're wrong. The actual instruments are a nice part of avoda, but they're actually not the primary part of the avoda. The Iker Shira is bepeh. The Iker Shira, right, the primary Levitic song was sung with the mouth. But therefore, again, the instrument. Now, we'll say, what's the role of the instruments? It's an accompaniment. It's nice. Everyone agrees instruments are always beautiful. But l'maisa v'la avodi. So the Shira is part of the avoda. The instruments are an add-on. Very nice, but they're not part of the Iker Shira. And therefore, again, ve'ena doches HaShabbos. And therefore, they're not doches Shabbos. I will say, so this is really, I told you, all right? I feel like I delivered on this. It is quite riveting. Right? I will say, so again, we have a fundamental machlokes, ultimately, again, on the Shira in the Beis HaMikdash. Machlokes Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanon. Rabbi Yossi, the Iker Shira Bekli. Shira could only be performed with instruments. And therefore, again, the use of instruments in the Beis HaMikdash will be Docha Shabbos and, of course, Docha Yom Tov. Rabbanan say, no, Iker Shira Bepeh. Primary Shira is by mouth. Instruments are beautiful, they're wonderful, but you don't need them for Shira. Therefore, they're not Docha Shabbos and Yom Tov. However, listen to this. Aval Shir Shal Shoeva, but everyone agrees that Allah Lamaisa, the instruments by the Simchas Beis Hashem, which was, again, the singing that accompanied the Nisach HaMayim, divrei hakol simchahi ve'ina dochas haShabbos. Everyone will agree that by Simchas Beis HaShoeva, right, by the celebration of the drawing of the water, Nisa Chamayim, it's not, by the way, it's not, understand, it's not really the drawing of the water, right? It's the pouring of the water, okay? But everyone agrees that the musical accompaniment to that is not part of the avoda. It's what the Gemara calls simcha. What's simcha? What's simcha? Kishmokinu. What's simcha? It's part of the joy. It's part of the celebration, but it's not part of the ikra avoda. Therefore, everyone will agree that's what? That Allah Chalamayis, that's not Tocha Shabbos, not Tocha Yom Tov. Which is why in the Mishnah, you find no machlokes about that particular nekuda. Everyone will agree. So I will say, at most, there's a machlokes Rabbi Yossi in the Rabbanon about general shira. Is general shira bepeh, shira bekli? But when it comes to the instruments of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, everyone will agree that's not part of the mitzvah. It's only simcha, and therefore not Tocha Shabbos, not Tocha Yom Tov. So we'll say, now this is really very interesting because this is a fundamental machlokes about the Beis HaMikdash. So Rabbi Yosef, Amin Allah. Rabbi Yosef, so how do I know that this is the machlokes? How do I know that the machlokes is really about the fundamental nature of shira? This we learned, kli sharetz sha'asa anshal eitz. But let's listen to this interesting conversation here. What happens if you make a kli sharetz out of wood? We'll say, you know what, we're going to stop over here for today. I'm going to leave you on a little bit of a cliffhanger. Don't worry, by the way, everything will equal out at some point in time. Right? The universe always writes itself in Miras Hashem. We'll be okay. We'll be okay. We'll pick up Miras Hashem again with the rest of this discussion tomorrow. Shkoyach.